Thank you very much for having me. I'm really sorry I couldn't be here last year, but it's great to see you all, or at least virtually see you all at this point. And I'm hoping that at some point, at least in the future, we might have a chance to also have a face-to-face discussion. Before I sort of properly get into the presentation, I should sort of admit in a way that what I'm going to do today is a little bit of what you could call a therapy session, where I'm going to start with saying, oh, well, I haven't been feeling quite right recently. And then do the usual thing as soon as you see a doctor, and then I go, but actually, it's not that bad. And overall, it's just a minor issue. And then eventually, what should happen in any good therapy session, I'll then switch to saying, well, maybe there is a bit of a problem. So my talk's going to be split in three segments, if you will. The first one is going to be relatively brief. And it's about sort of taking stock of some of the current challenges that we face in the research library world. That I don't think is going to be a revelation in any particular way. It will be many challenges I think that you're all familiar with and that we all face in our work day to day. This is the part where I'm going to say, I'm not quite sure, maybe I'm not feeling quite right. Then the second part, I'll go a bit into the work that I'm currently involved in or leading on at the British Library to sort of set the library up for the challenges of the coming 5 or 10 years or so. It's only going to be a snapshot of some things that we do. And it's the part in the therapy session where I'm going to say, well, maybe it isn't such a problem. And after all, we are well prepared. And then in the third part, which for me is the really most important one, I'll then take a perhaps slightly over-pessimistic view at some of the wider challenges that we face and why I think maybe some developments in the research library sector might not go exactly as we envisaged they might. And then I'm hoping that when we come to the end and the discussion, that you as my therapists will then tell me it isn't all so bad, and maybe just slightly over-dramatizing it and sort of help me get over this problem. But anyway, I think that will be for you to judge. This gives you sort of a rough idea of what to expect. And as you've heard, I'm a historian by training, so it's kind of difficult for me to talk about the future without at least briefly talking about the past. And in the spirit of a therapy session, this is about the question, why are we here? From a library perspective in general, and I think a research library perspective in particular, I would argue that's relatively easy to answer because we're here for knowledge. We're here to help people find, access, use, and then share knowledge. That, I think, in the most simple language is how I would describe the mission of libraries and research libraries in particular. And it's arguably been one that's been the same through the centuries, or perhaps even longer, since the start of libraries. What has changed, though, and will keep changing, is the way how we do this. I mean, for example, in the past, being here for helping people to access knowledge might have meant clergy or rich people or men or white people. And today we have a much broader, more inclusive terms of the people that we serve, which is really everyone. So I think how the audience is seen in libraries has changed. The media that we deal with have changed, and I'm sure will continue to evolve. The buildings, the way how we develop and deliver our services, that's all has changed. And to an extent, that's a perfectly normal thing that we shouldn't panic about. And I sort of set this at the start because I don't want to say in the following that just because things are more digital, for example, everything is going to radically change. I think the mission still stays the same, but we have to constantly evolve how we deliver this mission. And that then brings me to the first part of the therapy session, to briefly say a few words about challenges in the changing environment in the way as I see them. It's mostly sort of to make sure that we're all on the same page. If we go back in the olden days, then you can say, well, buy it or build it and they'll come. You first need to set up a library building. And as you can see, I'm not an architect and design is not exactly my strength, but you have your building and then you buy or acquire some content, you have your library collection. And then you can be relatively confident that people will come and use it. That's a slightly sort of oversimplified fairy tale version of a library, but in broad terms, in particular, say speaking from the British Library's perspective, that for a library that for a long time has had fantastic buildings and a magnificent collection that some people rate as the largest in the world, where arguably 50 years ago or so, we could have said, we are relatively confident that whatever you want, come to our building, we have this fantastic collection, and we can meet your needs. And sure, there's some other content and some specialized bits that we don't have. But broadly speaking, we can meet your needs with what we have here. And there are many other large libraries, or very small libraries that are specialized, that arguably at some point could have said the same. We are confident that for what we're here and for the people that we serve, we can meet their needs from our collection. So this is the slightly fairy tale version of how it was in the past. And if we look into the now, then I think we have to realize, even from the point of view of one of the biggest libraries in the world, that our collections are shrinking. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, the British Library collection is growing by hundreds of thousands of items every year, but it's a relative shrinking. Relative to the amount of knowledge and information out there on the internet, our collections are shrinking. And I've sort of tried to capture this in the diagram, where there is the green bit, that's content that we ourselves hold and own. And then there is content that we can give people access to on site or remotely, content that we've licensed, say for a certain amount of time. And then there is open access and even broader content. So I think it's relatively clear that even if we maybe thought in the past we can meet all user needs from our own collections, we at the British Library can't do this anymore, and I think most libraries will also struggle to do that. So we need to think about collections in a different way, and a key aspect of that is, I would argue, to connect our collections to relevant content globally, to make the collections as we have them more useful. So that's a general observation, I think, on the changing nature of collections and the importance for our users. And I'm now going to move into 4 contexts to sort of describe what's changed over the last years in the environment. For the first one, I think it's realizing that our users work differently. You know, I quite like this diagram from a colleague in Oxford called Dave DeRue. And he's sort of on 2 axes tracking that where the X and the Y axis are meeting. This is sort of the typical library users of the olden days. It's a single person working in a singleton way without very much technology. And then you have one axis on which there is more technology and another one that's more people. And the argument that Dave is making, that we are effectively moving up, or in case of the people axis, sideways quite rapidly, where even people who work as lone scholars will use some aspects of computation and technology in their research, but increasingly we see more and more collaboration, particularly in the sciences, but also in the arts and humanities. We see social networking tools becoming more crucial, and we see more and more data being used in research. And the point where, at least Dave would argue, this is all going is that research becomes much more of what he calls a social machine. That's the point where collaborative working and working with more advanced computational techniques, bigger data sets in a much more social way is more and more prominent. And in general, that applies across all disciplines, although some are obviously further on in this journey or doing it in different ways. So our users are changing, and in many disciplines, just sitting on your desk by yourself with a book is not going to cut it anymore, and hasn't been cutting it for a while, arguably. But the user expectations and behaviors are also changing. And I think this is, in the most simple way, I think, encapsulated by the Google search box that's really changed what people are expecting, which is a very, very simple way of finding content that's easy to understand, takes out a lot of the complexity, is ideally beautiful to look at, works across all sorts of devices, and you can access it from wherever you are. That's already been a user expectation for years, but I think with every new generation of users, this is more and more embedded. And even those of us who've been around a bit longer, I certainly look at library catalogs very differently than I looked 20 years ago. And And I also find that in many cases, I prefer actually going to Google over even using our own library catalog, because I sometimes can find things quicker there than in a system for which I'm arguably responsible myself. So not only are users working differently, they're expecting a different kind of user experience. And this is not just a matter for search, but it's also for access. I've sort of taken a screenshot of these two tweets, which I found quite interesting. It's from an academic who's said he's now routinely using Sci-Hub for off-campus access to journals. And that's not journals that he couldn't legally access. It's journals that his university has paid for because he finds it too troublesome. He gives the example of 5 minutes to failing to get through the authentication, whereas 5 seconds just straight go to the PDF. So there's an expectation that things should be easy and smooth, and there is someone who understands that he didn't need to use Sci-Hub, but uses it simply for the user experience, not to get access to content that he couldn't get normally. And I think that's a very common approach. And it's something where it's easy to say only point at publishers and say they're failed users. Arguably, I think both libraries and publishers together, we haven't managed to create what, for example, the music industry, after some teething problems, has done, which is give a user experience that's so easy and simple that people are happy to pay for it. That's not what I would expect as a library, but I think it shows that people value that experience. And the music industry has managed to largely stop illegal downloading because they've understood that it's about not just the content, but also the content and the user experience. What else is changing? Budgets. Speaking just for the British Library, when I joined the organization, we had an acquisitions budget of roughly £16 million per year. And at that time, the pound was stronger than it is now. And over the years that I've been there, it's shrunk and shrunk per year. And we're now getting to the point where we're in the region and in fact, moving towards below 11 million because we had to make cuts to our acquisitions budgets. I appreciate many university libraries didn't have to make quite as radical cuts. In fact, some had the chance to increase their budgets. But there isn't anyone, even at the most wealthy organizations, and I mean, as you've heard, I worked at Imperial College before, certainly not an underfunded university, but there isn't anyone who would say that the acquisitions budgets are big enough to license all the content that our users want. And even where we could pay for it, some prices arguably don't really reflect best value for money for our users. So not only are our users' behaviors changing and their expectations, it's a challenge to, where the content is closed, be able to get that content for our users. Now, thankfully, in some ways, one could argue, the whole open movement, scholarly communication, open science of all these aspects has changed that, and that more and more content is now freely available. And I think that must be a positive thing for all of us in the library information community. But it also has a consequence, which is if the content lives out there on the internet, and if people are quite happy to use Google and so on, they will increasingly less so look to us for being organizations that help them to get to that content. But then arguably, they might be looking for us to help them to publish their content. But I think it's a not insignificant shift where discovery and access to content, to key elements of librarianship, one could argue in all this change become less important. They're not the only thing that makes librarianship, but they are quite important. And I think we need to be clear sort of what our answer is to this. Interestingly, bringing this back to the British Library for a moment, we have, over the last few years, run quite a bit of user research. And what you see here is a snapshot of non-users. My team have sort of gone out a couple of years ago deliberately to ask people why they're not using the British Library. And I mean, a key thing that you will see is, and this is a problem more for National Library than University Library, is that people didn't know that we had a particular service, or they hadn't really considered using that service. I think you wouldn't find this with a university library. Generally speaking, people are aware that it exists and at least at a high level understand the services. But what's also quite interesting, looking into the data in a bit more detail, largely what our users have told us, we can broadly find what we want online. And, oh yeah, there is this British Library, but it's either too far away for us to get to, Or, well, I'm finding what I want online, so why do I even need to think about this resource? Again, this will be different for different types of users, but for us, it's very clear. The starting point is Google. They would say they trust us in our libraries, but they also seem to have a trust that things they find on Google will surely be correct. And while they know there's falsified information on there, at least that panel of over 1,000 people selected from across the UK felt that they didn't really need to go to a specialized library resources, because what they are looking at online is probably good enough. And they only consider libraries as a sort of tool of last resort. If they really can't find it anywhere online, then they come to us. And that's an interesting shift. I think if we had asked that same question 50 years ago, we would have had a very different answer, although travel distance in the case of the British Library that's largely seen as a London-only organization, even though we're also present in the north of England, is a sort of more special case. So we can see, and there's lots of other research out this, that user behavior is changing and that the expectations are also changing. And then we come to the point in this therapy session where surely it can't be all this bad, because libraries have known that this is coming for a while, and they have all in their different ways been preparing for it. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about some things that we're doing at the British Library to prepare us for that change. And then I'll, in the final part, come back to a question whether these approaches will actually come through in the way that we hope they do. So what we do, I think, when approaching a challenge like this is we start with strategy. We've updated over the last 2 years several of our strategies. The one that's just recently been published is our content strategy. It's called Enabling Access for Everyone. And that's the strategy in which we describe what content we acquire and how we acquire it. For the National Library, obviously this is quite important. And we've decided, and it's time to make some changes to it and say, our money isn't stretching as far as it could. We need to listen much more closely to our users so we can use the resource that we have wisely. So it's a much more evidence-based approach that also looks much more at data that we get from our users. And we'll obviously still have to collect everything that's published in the UK. That's what we call legal deposit. But the key driver for us is demonstrating value to the research community. That's today, but also looking forward and having a view on what could become relevant or remain relevant over future years. We've also made a key element of our strategy that we now prefer to connect to content rather than collect it ourselves. There's costs involved in collecting, storage costs, and so on, and significant effort, and there's just too much out there. So increasingly, our preference is to point other people to content, at least where we have a reasonable hope that that content is not going to disappear. And it also means that we've committed ourselves to do something to improve discovery of open access content and really shift a library that has been largely about acquiring to pointing to external content. A couple of years older is our service strategy for research. We haven't published that document, but I've included a link here to an article in which I've summarized some key elements of this. It's an overarching strategy for how we support researchers, and for the National Library, that means not just academics and students, but really anyone who wants to use us for research. And a key element of this is that we want to enhance our national collection through services that help to open up and also sustain a global knowledge environment, because we see a responsibility to embed ourselves much more in a global knowledge environment, but we also realize that we are now much more dependent on it, so we need to contribute and do something to sustain it. And under these two major strategies, we've developed a whole host of smaller strategies, one for discovery services, for example, and one for ones that I've picked up. Possibly the most ambitious one is our data strategy that we've had for a few years now, where we articulate the vision that we want research data to be as integrated into our collections as text is today. If you think through what this means, it's incredibly ambitious and it will take us a long time to achieve it, but that's the journey that we are on. And obviously, it's not just us, there's many research libraries who are now increasingly also develop their data capacity and services, so it's a sector-wide challenge. For delivering our strategies, we have a host of programs. I'm responsible for 2 under the Everything Available umbrella. We haven't split things into a digital and a physical program quite deliberately, because we're strongly of the view, and I'm certainly very strongly of the view, that there's no point in thinking about any element of the library service that isn't at least partly digital. And most library services are in some ways enabled by physical. So the challenge is not digital or physical, it's about bringing these 2 together to an environment. So what we've committed to is updating our on-site services, our reading rooms in the public spaces, and what we call that knowledge spaces, and to update our online services. That's the Open Library program that's focused at online services, but through Discovery and others, also very much links into our print collections. What we do in terms of updating our spaces, this is sort of a high-level summary of how we define the program. And a key bit in there is that we want to make our spaces more flexible, because we realize the way how our users use them is changing and is continuing to change. And therefore, we need to have spaces that are much more flexible, which is a challenge for a library that has architecturally, by some people, maybe heavily criticized, but even more people love building. That's so important that it's now listed. Denkmalschutz is the German term. So we have to be very careful with the changes that we make to the building. And realizing this, we thought there is no point in changing from one definitive to another definitive, but rather realizing that we have more flexible spaces. We have to bring technology much more into our reading rooms. And we have to recognize that ways of working are increasingly not people coming to see our collection items, but people coming to meet others, although in the current COVID situations, that's a bit more challenging. But to think about knowledge creation much more is not just only driven by the content that we have, but by content, spaces, and by generally being much more open and inclusive. That's particularly relevant for us because the British Library is open to everyone, but has, I think, certainly in some communities in the UK, that view that we are an elitist organization that has a colonial past and is not for, or is rather only for academics, which we really aren't. So it's also about changing the perception of what we're doing. A key element in all of this is digital skills. For us to grow them, helping our users to grow them, and to work more and more broadly across the collections that we have. We've had for years now British Library Labs, one of the earlier library labs that have been set up, and for some in the community model. What we're currently looking at is sort of how can we scale this up and have more spaces in our reading rooms where people can use digital research method, data analysis, and collaborative working to work on the content that we have. So it's moving from project to really being embedded across all our reading rooms. And that's not an easy thing to do because you need skills and resources to do that. Speaking of skills, we're incredibly lucky that in our building, we are home to the Alan Turing Institute. That's the UK's National Data Science Research Institute. They're their own organization built from many universities. We just sort of make space available for them. But this has been set up quite deliberately so that we can tap into those skills. And we're now starting, they're still a relatively new institute, but as they're more established, we're now starting to work more with them. An example is a project that we call Living with Machines. It's a, certainly for arts and humanities, fairly well-funded project that we do with a set of universities and the Alan Turing Institute. And from a skills perspective, I think what we want to do is understand how we can use machine learning and artificial technology. What we are doing in the project is digitizing more content from the Industrial Revolution, and then looking at how we can use new technologies to extract information, for example, to link from reportings in newspapers, of which we have many, to survey map, to census data and others. This will, I think, lead to some interesting results in itself, but the idea is really that it's going to be transformative about how we can work with our collections and to increase our understanding of what artificial intelligence technologies can or can't do. And I think that's the critical questions that we as the library community need to have an answer for. We're also changing the way how we share our collections. Currently, there is no single point where you can discover everything that we have. It's grown organically and historically, as I think we would probably put this. So we're working very hard on offering humans one entry point where they can really search across all the millions of items that we have. But then also realizing that we can't actually expect our users will come to us, we have to come to them. So what we're looking for is building more integrations to, for example, platforms like Wikipedia, and generally open us up through machine interfaces that we can send our content to where our users are, or that other platforms where your users are can pull the content in and make it more easily accessible. And I think that's a critical thing in a digital age. Not expect that users will come to you, in particular if your user experience maybe isn't as good, but see where you can bring your content out to your users. We're also working with other organizations. We've been quite lucky in that out of a larger program that's called Towards National Collection, we've had several successes in having projects funded. And we're currently preparing bids for next stage. But it's an ambitious multi-million-pound program from the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK to try and build a virtual national collection out of the content held by big national institutions, museums, and libraries. So it's the stepping beyond the institutional boundaries and realizing that digital allows us to bring things together that, from a user's perspective, belong together, but that are being held in different organizations. A key way of doing this for us is investing in persistent identifiers as a means to connect information. The British Library has been quite active in this space for a year. We're one of the founding members of DataCite, and we currently offer services to over 100 organizations in the UK through DataCite, helping them mint DOIs and support their research data services. So it's not just about us and our collections, but I think it's as the library community working together to help everyone to make their content visible and to connect it so that we together can create something more meaningful for our users, and hopefully more meaningful and better than big commercial services like Google can, because they will never be able to focus on the detail and the specificity of our collection as much as we can, as much as we have an obligation, I would also argue, to do. Only we can help people access our collections, and that's in a way what we should be focusing on. We are also investing quite a bit in open science. We're generally updating the whole library digital infrastructure. The key project that I'm overseeing is redeveloping the preservation system in which we hold not just our content, but the National Legal Deposit collection for all the national libraries in the UK. That's a relatively large petabyte scale data store with way over 5 million items. And so as we are renewing this, we're also looking at some of the repositories more on the access side. And we came to the conclusion that, I think like many bigger organizations, we support too many systems. So what we're currently working through is building an open repository platform, which will be backed up eventually once it's all fully in place by a preservation layer, linked into services such as digitization that we offer to help get content on there, and then have several sort of access layers and repositories on there. We didn't up until recently have our own institutional repository like many universities do, but we also do research, so we build our own. But again, I didn't want my team to build yet a separate system. We look after Ethos, that's the National eThesis service, where we have information over 500,000 PhD theses and well over 250,000 full-text PhD theses. So we're all setting this up, and then we were approached by some of our partners who said, well, if you're building this, couldn't we just join in? So we then started developing a shared repository that's also part of this, and in fact, are now in a position where we can offer repository hosting to other organizations. The first thing that we've launched is the shared research repository for cultural and heritage organizations. There is still technically a pilot, but we are currently in the process of updating the system and then moving on to a service. So this is something that we worked on with some partners in the cultural sector, where we now have a platform where each organization has its own repository that they manage. As far as the content is concerned, we provide the technical infrastructure together with our technical supplier. But we've also built a shared layer where you can now search the repository content of these institutions. We're now moving from pilot into service, where our partner organizations will contribute to the cost. And the aim is to sort of grow this shared repository and make it financially sustainable. But we're also talking to other organizations who want to join and have their own repository, or perhaps are interested in a consortium approach. So this is sort of our way of not just fixing an internal problem about having too many systems, but making something available built on open source technology that also allows others, if they don't already have one or don't want to manage their own repository, to come into this platform. So that's sort of a snapshot of the work that not just, but in particular, I think my department have been focused on over the last few years at the British Library. And you could say that we can lean back and say, oh, well, yes, this is all changing, but we are really well set up. We have strong open science services. We have people who are willing to contribute financially to some of them and help us making them stronger. We have a new content strategy. We've talked to our users to understand what they want. We are really quite well set up. And in some ways, we probably are. But a while ago, I did this thought experiment, which is said, well, let's just do a fast forward 9-10 years from now and see what do we think could the environment look like, and how might some of the aspirations that we as a library community have played out. So the first assumption that I've made is there is no longer debate around open access. In 2030, open access has won. I think that maybe a few years ago would have seemed a bit more radical assumption, but we can broadly assume, I would say, that open access will be the dominant way of scholarly communication in 2030. We could say, well, that's terrific. That's an achievement that the library community has worked hard for, amongst others. And we could sort of say, fantastic, job done. But it has, as I've implied earlier, a few implications, which is the current, or in particular, I should probably say, sort of older library model is a little bit more of gatekeepers, in that specific libraries had access to content and they made it available for the users, and there was often no other way of getting to the content. That's not the case for open access, of course. It's there for everyone. And normally the answer that we have in the library community is, well, if we are not now sort of the gatekeepers to closed content, we are rather organizations who support others to make their content open and to find open content, then that's just a shift of what we do. And that is fine. But I sometimes wonder if there isn't a risk that we overestimate how big our role in this is going to be. Just sort of take an example. If I had to think right now what's one of the best open access discovery tools, I wouldn't necessarily turn to the British Library Catalogue, even though we discover open access content. I would probably call to Unpaywall and the services that drives, or others that sort of specialized tools like the open access button. There are small, agile organizations, sometimes there's only a couple of people, who are good with technology and who deliver specific open access discovery services that frankly often are better than what we can do at libraries. And obviously there's Google and others who have discovery services. So I'm not quite sure how far we'll have a role really actively in open access discovery. Well, we might say, well, that's fine, but we will help others to publish content. And this is true. But you can also take a more sort of critical view and look at the Wellcome Trust. The Wellcome Trust in the UK has been arguably the trailblazer for open access policies. One of the reasons that the UK is fairly well developed in open science is that the Wellcome Trust went first and then other UK funders followed. If you look at what the Wellcome Trusts have done, they've now built their own publishing platform, Wellcome Open Research. And I'm increasingly wondering, from the perspective of a research funder, does it make sense to support universities to each run their own repository? Or wouldn't it be much better to go out, procure a repository publishing platform, and say everything that we fund has to go in there, job done? This might be more efficient sector-wide. It might be a good thing, it might not be. But I think it's questions that might very well be asked, and where we find that libraries in discovery and even publishing that content might not have as big a role as some of us who've worked for years very hard, say, in our repositories, might think at the moment. And I think that goes more widely into open science, and I sometimes wonder how far we can really support it. Now, I don't mean that we can't help our users, researchers, students, and others with open science. I don't mean that we can't run open science services, but increasingly over the last few years, we've seen more and more money invested in technology. And many of us, I think, struggle in keeping up with the user experience, of the complexity. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, you could build a reasonably competent repository on a basic open source package. And you can still do this now, but arguably now there will be many institutions who will say, well, we're not just looking for a repository, we're looking for a research information management system. And then it starts to become more difficult, still doable. But there are more and more expectations. The scale of data that needs to be supported is growing and growing. And players who are much better at technology, much better funded, pumping lots and lots of money into it. So I wonder, in particular because of how shiny some commercial products will use, how far, at least from a technical infrastructure point of view, many libraries will really be able to keep up with this, or if we don't end up eventually just procuring some technology services from the cloud and losing a level of control and actual support, an understanding of a platform. You can think this further and look at something that I consider really important and positive. Persistent identifiers, DOIs, ORCID IDs, and others are a really positive environment development and something we need. And we have been quite active in this field at the British Library, for example, in a project called Freya. It's a EU-funded project that's recently closed. That involved many of the sort of leaders in persistent identifiers in the research space. And if you haven't had a chance, I encourage you to sort of look up the project and see what's been delivered over the last few years. So generally, persistent identifiers, I think, are great. But to an extent, I think what they signify is an end of local data. You have your data, that's fine. You enrich it with identifiers. You put the ORCID IDs in of authors. You link to other relevant data sets or DOIs. But that data set will only really be meaningful if you can follow that knowledge graph that all these different persistent identifiers are building. And that doesn't work on local data. That only works when you are connected to all the other systems that hold that kind of information. And arguably, at the moment, it's a relatively small number of organizations like DataCite, Crossref, and others who hold all these sort of linked data sets, if you will. And it means that we are, to a degree, losing a bit of control over our own metadata. And our own local system by itself will become a lot less meaningful. And what's actually going to be meaningful for our users is the connections that exist outside of our own system. And it's not just that they exist outside of our own system, they will also be fed and maintained outside of our own system. If you publish today, you add your ORCID ID, not in a local system at university, you add it at the publisher. The publisher will then hopefully link it through to your ORCID profile, and then from there into the university system, if you set it up that way. But it means lots of the enhancing of metadata and the curation will happen outside in other systems, and we'll just feed this data in. But we are arguably losing a role in metadata and cataloging if more and more of this is generated by users and by systems talking to each other outside of our control, and perhaps also outside of our understanding. Which then brings me to the next set of concerns, which is, I spoke earlier about bringing the content to our users. I regard this as a good thing, But to be able to do this, we need to develop interfaces much more for software than user interfaces for people. If our content is in the future consumed not directly through our system, but indirectly, if in the morning I pick up my smartphone and I say, give me all the data on climate change in the 17th century in England and how it is linked into social unrest and, say, the English Civil War. And then I make my breakfast and I come back, and on my computer is an amalgamated data set. And then I can start doing my work. As a researcher, that's really how I would like to work, but it means that will only work if you can pull data from different sources. And I'm sure your system will tell you that 7.5% of the data came from the British Library, but it will only do this if we've developed these interfaces for systems and not for people, because increasingly our customers will be the software that our users will be using. And interface development is perhaps not a strong suit of libraries, so it's something, again, that will become more and more dependent on our technology service providers, and we'll lose a bit of control and understanding, and possibly also visibility. And control, I think, is a key point. More and more of the algorithms that control this will be enhanced by artificial intelligence. They will have a level of complexity that even if we have the source code, we might struggle to understand. But in many cases, we might not have them because we get a cloud-hosted environment that does something. Our library management system is perhaps already or may soon be hosted in the cloud. Our discovery systems are hosted in the cloud. And in the past, when you had, say, a paper catalog, there was usually a librarian who understood how it was put together and who could help a user to find something in there. If you ask yourself at this point, how many people in your organizations would understand some of these algorithms well enough to, when a user comes to them and says, what bias is coded into your discovery system, to give you an answer? I fear not many. Interestingly, there are some researchers in digital humanities and others who start sort of researching this now and look at blind spots, things that your discovery system will not discover. And that's something I think that I'm concerned about. I'm also concerned about the bias that's built into these algorithms. We increasingly see cases, say, in the United States, where artificial intelligence is used to help judges. And if the artificial intelligence code is fed with the information that most of the people who have been sentenced for a crime are Black, it might then start assuming Black people are criminals and therefore ends up recommending higher sentences. And you might say, well, this is perhaps a bit far-fetched, but there has already been examples where this has happened. So there's always bias in coding. It's either in the data that you use to feed it and how you put the code together. And increasingly, these intelligences, how artificially intelligent they really will be, or whether it will just be assisted, is another matter. But they are built on biases that we don't understand. I would argue transparency has always been a key value for libraries. And relying on all this data living outside of our own servers, being managed by other people's code, we lose that control and understanding, and we might lose the ability to really confidently serve our users and to uphold that level of transparency that I regard as critical for library services. Now, interestingly, if you look at organizations that we worked with in the past, publishers, some of the big publishers are now really find themselves as data companies. This is a screenshot I've taken a little while ago from the Elsevier website. And you will see it doesn't say Elsevier is a global publisher. It says Elsevier is a global information analytics business. A few years ago, when I was at Imperial College, the Elsevier leadership visited us. And it was quite interesting because we wanted to talk about open access and research data. And they wanted to talk about data analytics. And they had just hired new people from big data companies. And they gave us sort of an overview of the millions or billions of data points that they could track. And they're very serious about it. And there are people in the community who'd hoped that open access would not just lead to opening up our research, but that it would also maybe break some monopolies or market dominance that some people in the community would argue it's been unhealthy. Interestingly, what we've seen though in open access publishing, that we've had more of a market concentration through open access publishing now than before, where there have been a couple of new big open access publishers, but largely it's the bigger publishers that have become bigger. Those of us who have been concerned about the influence that these big organizations have should perhaps be even more concerned, because to do data analytics really well, you need a level of infrastructure investment and competency and data to train your algorithms on that these large publishers have, but not many other organizations. So what we may find is we've previously paid big publishers to license content. We'll still be paying them to license some content, less so now than before, but largely we'll be paying them for their analytics services and for powering our open science infrastructure. And in principle, that's fine. I have no issue with working with commercial organizations. But my concern overall is where commercial means closed and where we don't understand the algorithms and how things work, then we can't be confident in our information infrastructure anymore. And that has to be a concern for librarians overall, I would argue. You could say, oh, well, this is all interesting for libraries that are the cutting edge of supporting open access, but we still have special collections in our library, and users will still come to us for that. And that's true. I think special collections are a treasure, and they are a huge responsibility to preserve them and make them accessible. But where they aren't digital, I think they will increasingly be at risk of not being visible, with in particular younger generations coming in for whom if it isn't online, it just doesn't exist. And where they are digital and where they are available under open licenses where they should be, you will find that you don't need to go to the British Library to access some of the content. You can go, as you will see here in the screenshot, to the Internet Archive, and you will find some of our content there. And I mean, that's absolutely fine. I have no issue with it. But we could see a future where our special collections also start disappearing behind some other commercials or non-commercial systems that aggregate and are maybe better than we are making this content useful for our users. From the user perspective, that's not a bad thing. But once you've digitized your special collections, then brings up the question, where will you add value? And where will that traffic go? And how will you justify your ongoing existence if more and more of that traffic goes elsewhere? And maybe at that point we say, well, we've digitized it all, it's now out there. And apart from being a dark archive, perhaps we aren't used for that anymore now. That's maybe a particularly dark view on this, and we're a long way away from having all special collections digitized. But we have to ask ourselves the question, will our special collections still be accessed through us? And if they aren't, what does that mean for our role, and how do we need to be structured and resourced in the future? Now, one area I think where we can be relatively confident is workspaces. We've had some issues, obviously, currently with the coronavirus, where people have stayed away from others. But I'm pretty confident that will eventually be over and people will come back to reading rooms. Again and again, when it's been said, libraries will go away in a digital world, we found the opposite. In particular, the more digital our information environment is, the more people value physical connections. But we'll have to keep updating our workspaces and make them more flexible and less focused on a desk with print content or a desk with a small subset of digital content. And arguably also find ways of opening our libraries more to people outside of the higher education community. And I've included in the slides here a report about partnerships in the UK between higher educations and public libraries, something also that the British Library is quite concerned about and where we put a lot of effort in. It's about thinking how we can open our spaces more and different activities that we can support. But that, I think, is a problem I'm pretty confident we can crack. There's good evidence, we've good contacts of our users. I think this is something where I'm looking quite positively. And in principle, I'm also looking positively in terms of information literacy, helping our users to develop their skills, and inclusion in particular, helping disadvantaged communities to get access to digital information. I think something that many libraries do, many public libraries do terrific work in that context. There's demand for it, and it's a good thing for society. But it also means that we have to continually update our own skills and become not just as good as we want our users to be, but develop advanced understanding. And that's a challenge, I think, from a staff development perspective, but it's also a challenge in terms of the salaries that libraries can pay, because many people who have these skills will be paid significantly more elsewhere. So we have to create a working environment that's inviting and it gives people purpose so that we can develop and retain skill. What I've generally found is it's usually not just about the money. It's about people who work in a digital environment and who are frustrated with, say, old-fashioned processes, with organizations that haven't embraced digital and what it means properly. And they leave, not just because they can make twice or three times as much money elsewhere, but they leave because the working environment is not what, as a young, digitally trained person, you would expect us to be. And I think we can be really successful here, but we have to change the way how we work. Some libraries are further ahead this than others. I don't want to say that there aren't huge successes here, but having that transition is a challenge. And it's also one where I think we'll see a different profile in terms of our staff, and that maybe the number of people that we employ will start to shrink, and we'll have a smaller number of people who do sort of everyday repetitive jobs because they can be automated, but we'll have to have more people with more digital skills and also perhaps more control over their work environment. And that's not always in the public sector space an easy change. So how can we ask ourselves, might this sort of thing now work out with, it's going to be fine, we're just supporting open science in the future? To sort of summarize what I've talked you through is, my concerns would be that in the future, our digital services will still be provided, but by a few and increasingly smaller number of big service providers over which we might not have the leverage of or control and the understanding. I think you see a risk that our role in technical open science services may be smaller than at least some of us expect. That could very well happen. We'll certainly, I think, in more areas find that we just can't build our own repository and keep up with multi-billion-pound or dollar companies. So we'll have to procure even more services, and we have to accept that not just the technical infrastructure, but also our information will be out in the cloud. There's a possibility that our role in discovery, access, and even managing content might be reduced the more library management systems are able to automate many of these tasks. So it's a loss of control and a point where sort of commercial systems could, in many areas, well take over from what we currently do. It's also possible that our role in open science services may be smaller. A lot depends on how funders in particular will approach this, whether they might, in fact, procure larger infrastructures. We could see that our repositories, for many libraries, a key part of the infrastructure, will increasingly disappear behind commercial discovery layers. And for those of you who, for example, are familiar with the Research Information Management System PURE, that offers Research Information Management System and a repository. Many universities want to consolidate. So we've had cases in the UK where libraries have basically been told by the university that they should switch off their repository because the Research Information Management System can do both. And it can do both, but we then found out that it's not as good as exposing that content outside of the microcosm of that supplier. And therefore access to the content has gone down, but it was difficult to do anything about it. We might also find that our digital special collections may not necessarily be exclusively accessed through us, and our role there might diminish, and that analog print content, if we can't digitize at least enough information to make it attractive, we'll see a further decline in use because people just don't realize it's there. And we have to deal with this transition for staff that I mentioned briefly, and therefore will now not summarize again. So this is sort of what sometimes keeps me awake at night and is a bit of my therapy session. I'm not I think, want to close just on a set of concerns, but at least flag one piece of work that I'm currently involved in that I hope will help a little bit, which is the digital shift. In the UK, we have a set of libraries, RL UK. It's many of the big research libraries. And we've had some discussions, also partly triggered by this sort of scenario setting that I did earlier about what might our libraries look like 10 years from now. And as part of the RL UK strategy, we've been asked to develop a digital shift manifesto. We've done this as a working group, which I've been chairing, and it's now being transformed into a sort of delivery group. So we came up with a digital shift manifesto, and I've included the link in here, what we think research libraries should be like in 2030, and mentions quite a few of the points that I've flagged before, but it also lists others, such as wanting to be environmentally sustainable, which I think is critical for any kind of public infrastructure good, and in fact should be critical for anyone, but also highlights things such as mastering artificial intelligence. And despite that sort of black box approach that I talked about, still having sort of some ethical principles and transparency in all of this algorithmic madness that we are seeing ahead of us. We haven't just developed the manifesto, we also have a delivery plan. This is just a snapshot. It's a larger piece of work, but the link's included, so you can take a look. We've, for the last few months, been running a set of seminars, and we'll keep doing those with speakers who are exploring different parts of the digital shift. But we'll be looking at a set of other activities, such as creating a strategic workforce plan for libraries. And this is led by our UK libraries, but it's open to other organizations, and we hope it will be useful for others. And one piece of work that I'm particularly looking forward to is trying to define requirements for open infrastructures and perhaps also procurement principles for how we provide and procure technical systems in the future. So this is one realization where we said, well, we need to tackle some of these problems as a library community. And I think this needs to be a much broader international approach. And I'd like to invite you to take a look and perhaps join in some of these activities if it's of interest. With that, I'm coming to the conclusion of my, in parts, perhaps slightly depressing therapy session. And I've sort of summarized a few main points. I think for those of us perhaps who haven't quite done that, to prepare ourselves, we should really strongly focus on enabling our users and see our collections as one means of doing that, realizing that it isn't our only strength, but a key part that we have to uphold is trust, transparency, and that largely comes from our people. So we need to think really well about how we can make that transition to perhaps might be smaller, more agile, more highly skilled library services, but how to do this over a longer period, how to take our staff with us and help in particular those who maybe struggle with some of these approaches to understand why it's necessary. We should think about our on-site services, our reading rooms, as not just places where knowledge is consumed, but as places of knowledge creation, and see what that means in the context of our own institutions. We should really think about adding value, not just say by building a system on our end, by building connections and having a strong focus on the user experience. And then I think that's for me a really critical part, and that's on the right-hand column. We need to have a discussion that's driven by ethics and by our responsibility about how do we think knowledge infrastructures globally should be built and supported? Who should have control over them? How can we understand them and make them transparent? Do we need open procurement principles? Do we need more investment in community or open source infrastructures? Again, to be very clear, this is not me saying we shouldn't work with commercial organizations, quite the opposite. But we should think about what we want from our suppliers and be clear that there are certain principles that we think should absolutely not just be supported, but core of infrastructures. And that's something we need to have a discussion about. We need to be sure that we understand the implications. We need to understand the impact of machine learning and other artificial intelligence technologies. And in all of this, we have to, as our content will start floating around more, be very clear that provenance information is not just something that librarians care about, but it's also a critical part of trust and understanding. And then finally, I think something that's also critical, the infrastructure might be provided by technical suppliers, but a key part where I think we need to think really well about is persistent access, the long-term preservation, what content that we hold is a public good that needs to be preserved for the future, and what requirements do we have for the suppliers that we work with and for our own approaches to make sure that globally as a library community, we can make sure that content is there. I mean, if in the future, magic technologies by tech companies can solve all the user problems, and the only thing we still do is make sure that the content on which it's based is still there, then that's not necessarily what I believe the library will look like, but it could be a good world for our users. But regarding anything else, I think one part that I regard as absolutely critical is the responsibility that we have to our heritage. And the other part, the responsibility we have in advising, supporting, and enabling our users and thinking about skills and the infrastructure that they can navigate that increasingly digital environment. And with that, I'm coming to the end of my part of the therapy session. I'm now looking forward to you telling me that I'm over dramatizing, I should just relax, have a cup of tea, all is going to be fine, or perhaps not, depending on what you have to say.